I'm Shar Jorgenson and welcome to Inspired by Shar. Today I'm going to show you how to make the 9-patch courthouse step block. It's a wonderful variation, actually to me it's a new variation of the log cabin. When I look at the quilt and explain it to you, you will see that the quilt starts out with a 9-patch in the center of the block, and then it goes out to the outside with the longer blocks. The courthouse step variation of it is the path of red that goes diagonally through each of the blocks. These blocks are separated by a panel, and each of these panels are different. Some have the pheasants. You saw the ducks here. You have geese flying up here, and I think these are quail. They're all a little bit different, and what I did was I fussy cut those to match the size of my courthouse step block. The quilt is all from the same collection of fabric called Migration. Linda Taylor did a wonderful job of quilting it. I was so excited when I saw what she'd done with this block. She's actually done circles as if it's a target in the courthouse step block. Then around the motifs or the panels, each of the blocks are freehand quilted, and she has put, for the ducks, there's water on the bottom, and then up here we see clouds, and she's accented each of the blocks depending on which panel is in there. Then on the outside edge, she's got a nice continuous line leaf pattern. The courthouse step block in this one was a 9-patch. You can also do it in a miniature version, and the one that I'm showing you over here is the same pattern, but it starts out with a 4-patch in the center of the block. With a little bit differentiation, you have a ivory going this way and then a different color going in this direction, so it has a different appearance, but you still have your dark side and the lighter side of the courthouse step block. The miniature one was quilted a little bit different. Because the pieces are so small, we have created an overall pattern to fit over just the dark area. So each of these darker sections has an overall quilting, and then on the outside edge, it's half of that feathered motif in here. And on the outside border, you'll see a feathered pattern around the outside edge. The next quilt that I'm going to show you over here is a plaid variation, reds and greens. Now when you're working with plaids, you don't have to worry so much about the perfect straight of grain. When you look at this piece of fabric here, it's not perfectly on the straight of grain. Actually, it's slightly off, and don't worry about that. Actually, I think it's a little bit more pleasing to look at, especially if it's in a plaid one. It gives it more interest. This one starts out with a 9-patch or a 4-patch in the center, not like the one that I showed you in the beginning, which was a 9-patch. And then this one has also got the steps going in each direction, but in 2 different colors. This one happens to be hand quilted, so if you like to do hand quilting, that's a fun one to do. The next one that I'm showing you over here we call Sugar and Spice. As you see, the stairway through this one goes through the center of the block only in one direction. This is one single block. Instead of putting the 4-patch in the center of the block, it's in the corner of the block. So you can build with the logs many different ways. This one going from the light in the corner up to the dark. So just by making that same block over and over again, twisting them 90 degrees, you end up with that design. The next quilt that I'm going to show you is a little bit different. It has the stars in the corner. This would be the miniature version of it. And when you look closely at the block, you'll see that the outer row of each of the blocks has a star in the corner of the block. That's also available with this pattern. The one off here to my right is the large version of it. Here you see the star in the corner of the block, and this is actually, it's your traditional log cabin block, but it starts out like a log cabin and then ends up with a star in the corner. Well, let's get started cutting the quilt that we're going to make today, which I call the 9-patch courthouse step. But as you can see by some of the quilts I showed you, you can spend a quilter's lifetime with this block and never repeat yourself. When you look at the design wall here, you'll see many variations of the traditional block, and just by twisting and turning the finished block, you see many different designs. The first one that I'm showing you here is a barn raising pattern. The streak going through here resembles the raising of the barn. In the middle, top middle, is called streak of lightning. Just by twisting and turning that same simple block over and over, you'll get all these different variations. On this one, we've done something different with the quilting. You'll see that we have done a continuous line leaf pattern in the light area, and then in these logs, we've just gone in the center of each of the logs. Then to the far right, you'll see one that's a little bit different. Actually, I call that one a rickrack pattern. Again, just by twisting and turning the block. And that one has a feather quilting motif through the rickrack design on both the light and dark part of the logs. The next one, it just turns into another, like a checkerboard pattern. And on that one too, we have continuous line feathers over the light area and over the dark area. And the last one that I'm going to show you is another variation of it. And again, by putting the two darks together, but alternating it, going this way, and skipping light to dark in this area, you get a real neat effect in that one. These are all done with the same patterns. Whether you use the miniature or the large ones, you can do the same variations. The tools that I'm going to use today are the acrylic templates that you see in front of me. They all have the 1/4 inch seam allowance included in them. They're transparent and they're laser cut as well as computer drafted, so they're very, very accurate. And the neat thing about these is not only can you mass cut from new fabric, but you'll be able to use your scraps of fabric as well. And I think that's a real nice benefit. It comes in 2 sizes. We have the miniature size up here, and then we have the larger size that I'm going to be working with today. They both come with their own individual book of instructions. This would be the larger one, and it has full color instructions from beginning to end, giving you great detail for many, many different quilts that you will enjoy for a lifetime. The small one also comes with its own book of instructions, and it deals just with the miniature shapes in that set. On all of the templates ahead of time, I put the little fabric grips on them, and that will keep them from slipping when you're cutting. It's very important that you put them in the far corner. That way you have used up, you don't want your fabric to slip on the final or the far out corner when you're cutting. So many times I like to get more life out of my rotary cutter, and when it starts to get a little dull, your fabric will move as you're cutting. Well, you've already seen the finished quilt, and this is the collection of fabric in front of you. I'm not going to cut all of the pieces, but I'm going to show you how I will treat some of them individually. So I'm going to start out with these 2 pieces first. Ahead of time, I have folded them up on the cutting mat, and I have layered the 2 colors that I'm going to use from the same shape. Now all of the templates are lettered, like A and B and C and so on. It's template C that I want to use, and to make sure that I have the right one, I'll pick it up and make sure. Template C is the one that I will be cutting these two fabrics from, and to save time I'm going to stack them and cut them at the same time. So what we're going to do is line up and straighten them both at the same time. And we'll trim off the uneven edges. And then we'll turn the mat Now we'll decide how wide we need to cut that strip. This one is 4 1/4 inches wide. And sometimes, if you want to double check, you move it along because sometimes it's harder to see some of the lines. So just double check yourself. It's better to check twice than to mess it up. Okay, now we're going to move it up onto a rotating mat to make it a little bit easier. We're so lucky as quilters today. We have all this nice equipment we can play with. When I first started sewing, or quilting I should say, I had scissors that I cut everything out with. Okay, we're going to make this as our first cut, and my pattern shapes were from cardboard that I used to save up from this and that in the house. So that is my first cut. And you remember in one of the programs I said if your strip isn't exactly the right width, you have that second opportunity to trim off the excess. Now we have the perfect size block, or log I should say, that goes here and here in our log cabin block. And I won't finish cutting all of those, but that's how easy it is to cut the logs for this part of the block. The next one I want to talk about, I want to treat a little bit differently because of the direction of the print in it. Two of the pieces in the quilt are cut. I'll show you where they are in the block actually. You have the darker fabric which goes here, and then over here you have the ones with the geese in it. But when you study this fabric, it kind of has a direction to the print. So this would be the bottom and this would be the top. So that one I wanted to cut a little bit differently. So what I'm going to do is cut those strips narrower. Oops, I better get up on the board here. We'll straighten it first. Oh, and you know what? I have 4 layers this time. I had prepared so that I could cut more at a time. You will love the accuracy in which you can cut with by doing it this way. Now remember, we want to turn the board without disturbing the fabric, and always double check the width of your strip and the length of your log. So let's see, which one is it that I need to cut? I think it's this one. I think it's the template E that I need to cut. You need to cut those strips 1 3/4 inches wide. So we'll move the ruler over. And I want the direction of this print to be cut in a different way. We'll move that off to the side. we will lay the template up on top. Now I have the fabric cut in the direction that I want it to go. Rather than this way, I wouldn't have really ended up with a nice texture. So you can cut your direction of your strips either way. I think in the overall quilt it looked best like this. There was one important thing that I forgot when I was cutting the other pieces, and I want to point that out to you. Most of the time when people cut their pieces for the log cabin, there's a little bit of waste that's involved in cutting, and that will happen from cutting the logs this way, because when I get to the end I'll have a piece that I won't be able to use. When you cut it this way, like I did the first set of strips, I have no waste when I get down here. If you do it in this direction, you will have just a little bit of waste in the end. And so if you want to save fabric, and if your fabric texture allows you to, it's better to cut the strips to accommodate the length of your log rather than the width. The pieces that are in the center I'm not going to cut for you. It's just smaller strips and then fracturing that strip into little squares. And those I could cut all three at the same time. I could have 2 layers of this, 2 of the red, and 2 of the brown, and I would be ready to sew real quickly. There's one more thing I have to tell you about, and that is cutting the panels. When I got the fabric with the panels in it, it looked like this, and there's all kinds of different panels available. And you'll probably find some with flowers and all kinds of different things. But this is what it looked like when I bought it. And I thought, wow, that would be wonderful alternated between each of the blocks. So what I did was I cut these all apart. Then I take the ruler and I'll lay it over the top of that panel, and I want a 9 1/4 inch square cut. And so I won't take the time to do it now, but I would center it over that panel, and then I would cut around it, spinning the mat board as I work my way around, and then I would have a little bit of, I think it's about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so actually this panel was perfect for this variation of the log cabin. I hope you've enjoyed watching me cut the block for this quilt, and now comes the fun part where we get to actually sew it together. Now that we've completed the cutting, it's time to do the sewing. And after I have finished cutting, I bring all the cut pieces to the sewing machine and I line them up in the order in which I'm going to use it. First thing we need to do is pass a sewing test, and this is explained to you in the book that comes with the templates. We're going to start out by sewing on an anchor cloth first. And I like to sew with a 2.5 stitch length, which is approximately 12 stitches per inch. The 2 first pieces are placed right sides together. And this is part of the 9 patch in the center of the block. And before I start chain sewing a whole bunch of pieces together, we'll make sure that these 2 are the right size before we continue on. What we're going to do is press that seam open. First finger press on the right and the wrong side. And then we're going to take template B and place it on top of those sewn pieces and see if it's a perfect match. As now you can see, we have a perfect match when we place the template on top. Both of those center pieces equal the B template. Now that we have passed the sewing test, we're going to start to chain sew, and we will send through pieces 2 by 2. I have two of the pieces that go into the 9 patch perfectly matched. And I'll just do a couple of them so that you can see what chain sewing is. This is a great pattern for beginners to learn on how to do patchwork. Chain sewing will save you a lot of time as well as thread. We'll go on to an anchor cloth. And the reason I like to do that, if I remember, is to say so that the beginning and ending stitches are as strong as the center stitches are when they're sewn. So that would be chain sewing. On each of these pieces you have to have 2 white ones. So in the center part of the 9 patch you have the red in the center and the cream on both sides of that one. So we'll continue and finish off this part of the 9 patch, or the center unit of the block. Now these 3 pieces sewn together should equal the C template. I continuously check my sewing to see that I have a perfect match, because if you don't, your block will become distorted. So constantly check yourself until you're confident that you have the correct seam allowance. Now those 3 shapes should equal the C template. Now I can continue with all the confidence and go to the next part. When I look at the design wall, I have the 9 patch in progress already up here, and you'll see that I have the center one completed here. Everything has been pressed, and then I have the 2 outer parts here. Now I will continue on making that 9 patch, and what I will do is I'll put these right sides together and I'll show you how to match those seams. There are a couple of ways that I like to do this, and the first method that I'm going to show you, I'm going to flip the top seam allowance to the left, or to my left, and the bottom one to my right. Now keep in mind I did press the seams open, but I'm still going to flip them in opposite directions so that they lock together. If you look at them sideways and feel, you can actually feel those seams locking. Then on the bottom side with my fingernail, I'll flip them both to the left side, and then I will insert a pin right along the sewing line through the top and bottom. Then I will flip the top seam allowance open, as well as the bottom seam allowance is flipped open, and the pin is hidden inside. That's one method of matching a perfect point. Then on the other one, I'm going to show you a different technique. I'm going to insert the pin straight up and down on the seam line through the top and through the bottom. Leave that pin standing and insert another pin on the front seam allowance, or the seam allowance that goes under the presser foot first, and then I will remove that pin, and I'm now ready to sew. And I'm anxious to see if we have a perfect match. We'll slow down when we come to the pin so we don't hurt anything. And then continuing on to the end, and then on to the anchor cloth to finish off that seam. We'll press that seam open. Oh, look it's perfect on that one as well as that one. What a nice way to find a perfect match. Pressing the seam open again every time so you have nice flat intersections. Then the next thing that you would do would be to put the other side on, and I won't do that because it's a repeat of what I just did. So that would be part of the 9 patch. When you're done with that, you'll have a patchwork that looks exactly like this. If you want to double check, then lay your template in this direction as well as this direction, and you know that you've done a perfect job. Continually checking yourself. Now we're going to add the next 2 logs. This one goes on top here, and look at how, because we have pre-cut everything, you have that perfect match, and we'll continue to add that log. You know, the nice thing about doing it this way is when you get to the end of your block, all of your blocks are exactly the same size, and you don't have to trim them with a ruler. And if you had to trim them with a ruler, sometimes you would have pieces that were in shapes like a wedge, and they wouldn't have that loggy look like you started out with. It's really a treat to be able to sew on such a beautiful machine. Today I'm sewing on the Brother Quattro, and you know, I learned how to sew on a treadle machine, and it's really nice to be able to sew on something so beautiful. See how nice that matches? And you know that every time you add a log and you end up with that, it's a perfect match. We just finished putting this on, so now you have to do this part right here. So you're going to sew the little red corner. We have to continue that path. Always guiding your fabric with the stiletto so you don't have uneven seam lines is really nice. Okay, we'll chain sew to save a little bit of time. Usually when I'm doing this, I go in mass production, and I'll do just the one part of the block until I have all of the ones I need, and then I will go to the next part. Now we'll sew the other one on. We need one more of those. I'll now take this one, add it on to this one, and again we'll have that, we'll see if we have the match that we want. Insert the pin right on the seam line, again through the top and through the bottom. Actually, what I would do is I would try both methods and see which one that you like, the ones that I showed you for matching the intersections. I think I'll give you a review of the other one. This one I just left the pin standing and then inserted the pin on the front side of the standing one. Whoops, I pulled out the wrong one. Can't do that. Okay, over here I'm going to repeat that matching thing where I flip the top one to the left, the bottom one to the right, and so they feel, you can actually feel the intersections locking. Flip the bottom one to the left. We'll pin right on the seam line through the top and the bottom, and then let that seam allowance flop open so your pin is actually hidden in both the top and the bottom side. And now we're ready to sew this one. This is a very, very fast block to put together. You notice how I don't have to stretch anything or ease anything because everything has been perfectly matched, and I'm continually making sure that I have always passed the sewing test. And you can pass the sewing test all the way through the block. Let's say you get up from your machine and go or shut your machine off and come back to it and forget to readjust, you know, your stitch width or your seam allowance. You could be easy to mess it up, so always check your scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. See how I continually have this chain of sewing going on? Okay, we'll sew onto the anchor cloth. See how we did here. Perfect match there as well as there. I really get a lot of enjoyment out of seeing that it's done right in the end. Then finger press it open. Now when you look up at the design wall, you'll see it, the next step in progress. Here I have added this unit on both sides, and now this one will go on here. Each time you add a log to the block, you add 1 1/4 inch to the size of your block. So each of these finish off to 1 1/4 inch in width when you have them sewn on. So then I would sew this one on. When you go a little farther over here, the very last round that you put into the block is this longest one, and I have pre-sewn this on in the corners, so you would match this seam just like you did the previous one. The finished block up in the center of the design wall is a 9 1/4 inch square before it gets sewn to the panel. You sew these two together, and when you do that, and that'll be the next thing I do, we'll sew these two right sides together. When you sew the panels on, you want to sew with the seam allowance facing you, because you want to make sure that those seam allowances don't flip backwards. So we'll start in the corner. See how nice that matches? Okay, we'll start here, guiding our fabric with the stiletto. The machine has a scissor button for cutting the thread, and when you want to take a break from chain sewing, cut your thread, and we'll see what we have here. We have a beginning of our first row of a 9-patch courthouse step block going together. The rest of the quilt goes together just like I've shown you. You just continue making more of the 9 patches, starting out in the center and then continuing on with the courthouse steps going out. Each one of these are called a step. I sure hope that you've enjoyed watching this quilt go together today, and I hope I've inspired you to make your own variation of the log cabin. Join us next time on Inspired by Shar.